Good morning, everybody. Thank you ever so much for being here at the Middle East Institute for our latest event on Syria, a pretty timely one, I think. I'm honored to welcome, first of all, our guest speakers, who I will introduce shortly, who've all been at the forefront of peacemaking efforts in Syria, to discuss their lessons learned and some potential pathways forward to resolving this seemingly never-ending conflict. Ending the crisis in Syria is incredibly important to this institute, and our roster of dedicated scholars have placed an immense value on Track 2 diplomacy, civil society efforts, and other forms of diplomatic and humanitarian engagement in order to bring the war to an end and relieve the immense suffering of Syrians. Today's event is especially important as we're bringing together experts who work in different areas of conflict resolution and who have worked in different areas of conflict resolution and who will provide various insights into their work and a conflict as a whole. Here, to give opening remarks for today's discussion, we're especially honored to have Hadi al-Bahra. Mr. al-Bahra is a current member of the Syrian Negotiation Commission, the SNC, and a member of the Political Committee of the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, also known as Etilaf. He was elected to be its president from July 2014 until January 2015, and has also played a role as chief negotiator in Geneva talks. So without further ado, let me welcome, please, a good friend, Mr. Hadi al-Bahra, to the stage to provide a bit of an insight into the Syrian opposition's current situation and to the recent small group meeting which took place here in Washington. Hadi, welcome.
Thanks. Hi. First, I would like to thank the Middle East Institute for holding this important, moderated conversation about Syria, and thank Mr. Charles Lesser for his continued effort in supporting the quest of the Syrian people for democracy and freedom. Also, I'm honored to be among colleagues who really contributed a lot to the Syrian cause, to Ambassador Frederic C, who was from first moment of the Syrian uprising, stood beside the values he believed in for freedom and democracy for the Syrian people. Also, my friend Salman Shaikh, who really contributed a lot in his continuous search for a way forward to advance the political process and to find a way among the many deadlocks which we are facing in our quest. Assad has won. This is an illusion where Assad regime wants everybody to believe. If we look at realities on the ground, the Assad regime with Russia, with Iran, with the sectarian militias he imported to Syria from various countries, from Afghanistan, from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Iran itself. They are in control of approximately 52 to 57% of territories inside Syria. And these territories are dense in population and poor in resources. So actually, he has no more resources to finance his own regime and the state of Syria. The oil, cotton, wheat, all agriculture products in areas not under his control. So if we look at realities today, and we look at the political effort and the political process itself, where it has reached, we find ourselves not in a very good position as Syrians. In Syria, nobody won, nobody will win. All Syrians has lost. We need to look now on how to save our own country, how to reunite our own country. The political process, which was completely monopolized and controlled by the Russian initiatives through the Astana process and through full control on the ground by the Russian forces and the Iranian forces, they were able to monopolize the whole process and hijack it into a different path. Today, as we hear the statement issued by various Russian officials, we see they are not keen nor have the real interest to give the go-ahead in establishing the Constitutional Committee, which is one small step forward into reinvigorating the political process itself. Also, facts on the ground. It's not very comforting that they will keep their word on the Idlib agreement, an area, very small area in Syria, in the north of Syria, with more than 3.5 million people living in that area under danger from two fronts, the extremist terrorist organization within the populations, and with the fear of a military campaign by the Russian, Iranian, and the regime itself. So these are the current situation in Syria today. We have a small window of hope for the international committee, and mainly for the three countries, Germany, France, and Turkey, who held their summit in Turkey around a month ago to push forward and convince the Russians to end the deadlock and open the way for establishing the Constitutional Committee. If they fail at that, then we have to really revisit the whole political process in Geneva, the Sochi process itself, and the Astana process. We need to redesign the whole political process in a way that will not permit it to be hijacked again by one country or group of countries, and it would be more weight on the Syrian people first and the international community to find a way forward. Thank you, and I'll be interested to hear what you say.
Hadi, thank you very, very much for those very useful contextual remarks, which I think will feed quite helpfully into the conversation that follows. And in regards to that conversation, let me first, before it gets started, introduce our two esteemed panelists here. The first to speak will be Salman Shaikh, the founder and CEO of the Shaikh Group, a former employer of mine. Before establishing the Shaikh Group, Salman was the director of the Brookings Institution's Doha Center in Qatar, where his research focused specifically on conflict resolution, domestic policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East, with a particular focus on the Levant. Salman has extensive experience working for the United Nations, including as Special Assistant for Middle East and Asia in the Office of the Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs, as the political advisor to the Secretary General's personal representative for Lebanon during the 2006 war, and as Special Assistant to the Special Coordinator to the Middle East peace process. Salman, welcome to the Middle East Institute. And the second speaker that we'll have here is Ambassador Fred Hoff, who's currently a professor and a diplomat in residence at Bard College in New York, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Rafiq Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council, until very recently the director of that center. Until recently, until recently, Ambassador Hoff was the director of the Rafiq Hariri Center, and in 2012, Fred was awarded the rank of ambassador by President Obama in connection with his then duty as a special advisor for transition in Syria. Ambassador Hoff was previously the special coordinator for regional affairs in the State Department's Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, where he advised former US Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell on the Arab-Israeli peace issue and on Syrian-Israel and Israel-Lebanon matters. Ambassador Hoff joined the State Department in 2009 after a number of years working in the private sector. Before that, he directed the Jerusalem field operations of the Sharm el-Sheikh Fact-Finding Committee, headed by George Mitchell, and was the lead drafter of the committee's 2001 report. So without further ado, I won't get into Syria yet, but the discussion will. As I say, we'll hear first from Salman on some lessons learned, I guess, from his extensive involvement in Track 2 efforts on Syria, and then a response from Ambassador Hoff to some of Salman's ideas and his own thoughts on the current US strategy in Syria, followed by a moderated discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Salman.
Thank you. Want me to go right? Good morning, marhaba. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Middle East Institute, and first and foremost, to be sharing the stage, the floor, with Dr. Hadi Al-Bara, and of course, Ambassador Fred Hoff. Thank you, Paul. Congratulations on assuming charge of this great institute. And thank you, Charles, for putting this together and bringing me here along with these other great folks. I also want to say I've been here nearly a week in Washington. I see some old friends here. We've been seeing folks in the administration and the relatively new team led by Jim Jeffrey. I was also at CENTCOM at the start of the week in Tampa. Weather was a bit warmer. And there, of course, it was a great honor and pleasure to meet with General Votel and some of the other senior generals. I should also say, and here as well, I'd like to express my condolences for the sad passing of Vice Admiral Scott Stierney, who I had the pleasure of meeting just a few months back in the Gulf. I'd also like to mention right up from the start the death of Leila Shorkani, an American citizen who was doing important humanitarian work in Syria under torture from the Assad regime. I speak to you first time in 4 years in Washington. We've been doing our work quietly. Charles made a great contribution to that as well, first under Brookings, and then under the Shaikh Group. We're very much focused and dedicated on trying to bring voices, ideas from the people themselves, in the case of Syria. And that is why we have kept a relatively low profile in our work. But given where we are, 8 years into this conflict, and there's always critical moments, but this is a critical moment in terms of trying to get the political process going. And given that my friend and old boss, Geir Pedersen, is also about to take over from my friend and old boss, Staffan de Mistura, it's probably a good time to say at least a few things. Dr. Hadi already laid out the context. Assad hasn't won. We hear from Syrians inside Syria, coming from Damascus, from coastal areas, the crisis of expectations, actually, that there is in terms of the great victory has not translated into great dividends. In fact, we have high levels of poverty, rampant corruption, a small group which is still controlling both the economic and political levers of power. I won't go more into that. Dr. Hadi's already spoken about that. Idlib, we do all worry that pretexts are being set, and the attack that we saw of, I believe it was tear gas, or whatever gas that then led to more bombardments around Idlib and the area, also could be something that leads to greater escalation in that northwest area, the so-called de-escalation zone. I want to focus initially on the northeast of Syria. This is what we have been talking about. For the last year or so, we have been engaged in trying to bring dialogue between Syrian Arabs and Syrian Kurds. As the effort to defeat Daesh has progressed, there is an increasing realization that we now have to try to, at least in that area, win the peace. And what it has told us is that whilst there have been notable successes on the security side, there is a great danger of polarization between some Syrian Arabs and some Syrian Kurds, but which could encompass the whole area. This is, of course, I mentioned this area because this is an area of particular interest to the United States in its battle against extremism, but also in terms of Iran and its encroaching role in Syria, and with regards to what kind of future Syria could be shaped in the future. And here, where we've got to get it right, and what we've heard in our dialogues, is that, of course, there is now a need to make the civil project much more inclusive, to open up the civil space, and for the international community to ensure that there is a real equitable distribution of resources in that area. There is a fledgling Syrian Democratic Council, but then much more work needs to be done in order for it to be truly representative of the communities, and particularly the Arab communities that are there. I mention all of this, and I'd be happy to speak more to it, because along with the other two areas, this is also an area where there could be potential escalation, especially as the links of particular dominant Kurdish party that is part of the Syrian Democratic Council, the PYD, to outside Syria, to Jebel Kandil, to the PKK, could lead to a reaction from the Turks. And it's one of the more tricky things that has to be done, is to thread the needle between keeping the Turks on board and moving into a governance structure and situation which is reflective of both Arabs and Kurds in that region. And it's the United States which has, in my view, the primary responsibility for that. Let me now go to the actual political process. We've been going for 8 years now since this conflict started. There is almost a sense of, well, what can we do? For 8 years, we have not had a serious political negotiation. For 8 years, we've had just more death and destruction. And whilst we look at now the efforts that are ongoing regarding Yemen, I must say, as somebody who focuses on Syria, I look at it with great hope, it further inspires us, but also with some sadness that we have not been able to proceed further with regards to Syria. And the single greatest reason for that is that there is one party in particular, and it's not the opposition, it's not other Syrians, but it has been the government of Syria, which has not really wanted to enter into a real good faith negotiation. There have been many attempts which have been tried. I, along with my colleagues, some of you here, have the dubious distinction of being on the borders or margins of every single Geneva round that's taken place, and it's just been like Groundhog Day, I must say. Now we are at the stage where there is an idea which has been developed, which is the idea of a constitutional committee. A constitutional committee which is reflective of what many Syrians have been telling us. We need to move towards a process which is more inclusive. Our work, in fact, has taken us to talking to Syrians, hundreds and hundreds of Syrians, over the last 6-7 years. One of the themes that always came up is that a binary regime-opposition dialogue by itself will not work because of the veto that the government side has, but that we are also change agents, and yet we do not find a place in such a process. Now, Staffan de Mistura, to his credit, over the last few years, has tried to broaden that base. Of course, a negotiation will probably still need to take place between the government and the opposition. But even the opposition and its ability to affect things will not be effective unless there is a relevant process. So that is why consistently, whether we are talking about folks inside Syria, those in the who are opposition-leaning, regime loyalists, and certainly independent-minded people who don't equate themselves with either side, we have continuously been told we need to design a process which is much more inclusive than what we had in the past. That has led to a couple of particular papers, which today I want to say we are putting on our website for the first time. In particular, there is a working paper on Syrian dialogue, which was developed for more than a year with representatives who came from regime-held areas, In fact, they were even given specific authorization for that, and those who had more opposition and independent-leaning views. They have, in terms of the actual elements of how do you make such a process more inclusive, let me just go through a few in that regard. Let me also just say from the start, there are no silver bullets right now when it comes to a political process. What we are looking at is a more gradual, in my view, a more gradual process, which introduces initially incremental change over an extended period of time. A negotiation which is driven, as I said, by a broadened Syrian dialogue, which involves a much broader cross-section of Syrians, including those from inside the country. It's been accepted on these sides that such a process should take place without preconditions. That's in our paper. And on the basis of what we call an open ceiling, while agreeing an agenda that covers very specific issues that must be tackled in such a dialogue, including around governance, the role of a president, not necessarily the president, the distribution of power, the role of foreign forces, security sector reform, and other such things. The point being is that we must work towards some sort of a set of political agreements, or what others would call a set of constitutional principles. In fact, this work built on the 12 living essential principles that the UN envoy identified. But there was a belief that you can't get into a constitutional process at this point in time. You need to be able to create the political foundations for one. And in that respect, I would say, as a child of Iraq and the UN's efforts in Iraq, where we ran 3 elections in 2005, one of which is a constitutional referendum, we have to be careful not to rush these kinds of discussions and dialogues, which will need to take place. But then the conditions need to be set. So what is being proposed here is more of a process which could take place in parallel to, for example, a constitutional committee and a constitutional writing exercise. But it's not a supplementary, it's not an afterthought, it's not an adjunct, it's absolutely essential that you have such a dialogue taking place at the same time. There is a firm insistence in our papers on the need for international sponsorship for such a process. It should still be UN-led, and it should be US and Russia supported. I'll come back to this whole dynamic when it comes to the United States and Russia, because still that is key in trying to move this forward. But we've heard a lot of lip service, a lot of statements about a Syrian-led process, a Syrian-owned process as such. But yet, a lot of what we hear is that a lot of Syrians who don't especially identify themselves with the regime or with the opposition have found that they not actually see a path in which they can be more creative. And it's interesting that when Staffan started to make his own process more inclusive by bringing in civil society, by bringing in the Women's Advisory Board or other women's groups, for example, bringing in experts, some of the best ideas, I would say the 12 essential living principles, for example, came from those quarters rather than just in negotiation between the opposition and the regime. Let me just say that if the Constitutional Committee doesn't take off, and we're all hoping that there's going to be a green light at the end of this month. We know the UN envoy, his statement on December the 14th in the Security Council, the activities of the small group, the Astana meeting, which didn't produce much at all, but also the meeting that took place in Istanbul, which involved France and Germany with Turkey and the Russians. We all know that there is an effort to try and bring this out. And I think, let me be clear, nobody should give the opportunity right now to open other doors or to other ideas where the Constitutional Committee is pushed to one side and we move on something else. Having said that, we have to think about how we can be more ingenious, even with regards to the work of that committee, and if that committee is not able to be established by the international community. Dr. Hadi, I was noted with interest what you said, that if we are not able to get this process going, then we're going to have to think very carefully about this whole process. And I believe actually this is where the great value of the kind of work that we've been doing with people over the last 3-4 years, particularly around the papers we're publishing today, is important. What would be bad, what would be sad, is that if this process doesn't work, we again sort of give up on the effort to find a national level, Syrian-led process. One can see what could happen. You could see an element of recrimination, finger-pointing, and of course it was the Russians who introduced this idea of a constitutional committee. But then they had to, of course, get the UN to take on that idea and for it to be under the UN's auspices and its umbrella. You could also have a period where we just wait. We wait for the UN Special Envoy, Geir Pedersen, to do the rounds, to try and find new formulas or try to still see how we can push forward on this process. We certainly probably will have a disagreement on whether this remains purely a UN-driven exercise and that there should effectively be a shunning of the Astana group and the Astana process as such. And of course, it's likely that in the event of no result when it comes to the Constitutional Committee, that the Astana group would look to see, nevertheless, how they can produce certain ideas. That won't work. And the Russians understood that when they finally agreed to take the Sochi Congress idea and the constitutional idea under the UN umbrella. But nevertheless, if there is a vacuum when it comes to ideas, as was the case a year ago, they will start to feel that they can establish facts on the ground, new facts on the ground, new terms that hew closely with one party. And of course, the UN cannot support such an unbalanced approach. More than anything, what I worry about is also escalation during this period. And I've already mentioned Idlib, what could happen in the northeast and eastern part of Syria. And so I don't think it's an option for us to just get into either a stalemate or recriminations. I think this would be the time for us to look seriously at the kinds of ideas that have been produced in the papers that we are publishing today. Ideas that put forward how you can have an effective Syrian-led, genuinely Syrian-owned process with international support and guarantees. Let me just come for the last 2-3 minutes when it comes to how do we move that forward? Russia. How do we move that forward if the Russians still are not helping us to move this process forward? Now, our work is bottom-up and it's top-down. We make great efforts to try to bring those Syrian ideas to key capitals. And Washington, of course, is one. The United Nations and European capitals are, of course, crucial, but Moscow. And in that respect, I have been engaging with Moscow actually since 2012 in trying to put forward ideas which we hope that they could come around to. In fact, in some way, Track 2s could take some credit for the unbalanced ideas that were produced that led to the Sochi Congress and sort of a broadened Syrian participation. Where we think the Russians are today is in a moment of more deep reflection. We know, I think for sure, that there are even divisions within the Russian establishment, but the decision is still to go as they have been, which is in support of Bashar al-Assad and trying to engineer a political process on their terms. Of course, that's not going to work. I would say, though, that it was circumstances of even a year ago and the fact that they do not, they want to cash in on the rising prestige that they have gained by engaging in Syria, especially since 2015, that they do want to put a political cap on their gains. And in order to do that, they themselves, in my view, have opened the door to newer ideas around a more inclusive process. Frankly, those ideas didn't come even from Europeans or from the American side. And so I think in conversation, we need to find a way by which there is a serious engagement, continued engagement with them about substantive ideas around the process which are more inclusive and which would stand a better chance than anything that has been tried up till now. I've been told over and again in recent conversations the Russians want to lead, but we know we can't lead all the way right now. We know the regime is suffering economically. We know we have to manage some of the internal difficulties that there are. That is why they've had to put in more military police and other such things. The low risk, high returns that they've got right now, we've been told, have now got to be turned into a retirement package before we start to default. So it's that impetus which we now have to sort of work on. And for me, there is no substitute for a Russian-American dialogue in that regard. Now, I know there are many people working on this, including in this administration, where we find it difficult, and they would point to us all the ways that they have been trying. But this is where the substance comes in. We need to find more ingenuity on the substance and discuss that with them. So, if you want a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned process, let's move towards one, a genuine one. Let us say, okay, we meet you here, but we raise you. Let's make it the case that there is a real space for Syrians of all backgrounds, outside but also inside the country, in order to be able to discuss the kinds of elements which are needed to make a real political process work. Let us see if through that we can construct new international guarantees and commitments for such a process. In my view, that is the only way that you're going to start to change the dynamic, a dynamic which I started off by saying where the government of Syria continues to have a veto on any process taking place. If we're able to do that, and again, it's not about regime change. It's about giving Syrians a voice and a future in shaping the future vision of their country. A country which is now in 3 pieces, where there are 5 different armies, where the economic situation has gone from bad to worse. When we speak to Syrians across the spectrum, that's not an achievement. And that is why the desire for change, the desire for transition, the desire to move from war to peace is strong as ever. We have to ask ourselves, if the majority of Syrians want that, if the majority of Syrians are suffering, if the majority of Syrians don't want Iran to take a greater role inside their country, if the majority of Syrians want a situation whereby which they want Syrians to return. Why is it that we don't have a process till this day that enables any of that to take place? Why is it? It's the process, stupid, in my view. And for that reason, that is why I hope you'll look at these ideas that are in these papers. There are two papers. One is around constitutional reform, which was produced in 2015-16, and a second which was done in 2017. These are 2-year and 1-year-long processes of dialogues, meetings which took place over the course of that period, sometimes 2 or 3 meetings a month with Syrians of different backgrounds. And I hope that these kinds of ideas will find much greater resonance when it comes to those who are really trying in international capitals and the UN to move things forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. With your permission, I'll just deliver my brief remarks from the comfort of this chair. I want to thank you and the Middle East Institute for inviting me to make a return visit to Washington D.C., a place I don't necessarily miss, but I'm very, very happy to be here at MEI, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to show up this morning. I'll be very brief because I'm mostly interested in knowing what's on your minds, and so we can have a conversation. First of all, let me say that I am a true believer in track 2 diplomacy. I've had the pleasure over the last several years of getting to know a couple of the top names in this. Obviously Salman, and also Dr. Peter Jones of the University of Ottawa. And over a 2.5-year period in Copenhagen, I was part of a track 2 dialogue with some very senior former Iranian officials, including some people who were either part of or closely affiliated with the Revolutionary Guards. This was not the sort of group that the Iranians usually roll out to handle and charm the barbarians. There were some really, really tough people, and there were 2 principal items of discussion. The first was whether the United States and its allies in Iran were ever going to get to a nuclear agreement, and the second was Syria. And Syria was the subject of some real knockdown, drag-out battles. Now, as Salman will testify, the real test of a track 2 dialogue is what it can contribute ultimately to track 1. If ideas can surface that officials can grab hold of and implement. In this regard, I guess the most significant thing that happened, and I believe this was probably in late 2014, after a particularly vicious debate over Syria, the American team and the Iranian team came to an agreement that Peter Jones really mediated, and that was that we were going to recommend to our respective governments, who were then engaged in negotiations leading ultimately to the JCPOA, but we were going to recommend to our governments that they have a discussion at the official level, obviously, on the humanitarian situation in Syria and steps that could be taken to mitigate the catastrophe that was going on. I was thrilled with this. I took this back to an acquaintance of mine serving on the National Security Council staff in the White House. His response to me was, "Fred, this is great, but who do we actually talk to? Who?" And I said, "You can't find that out?" He said, "No, we don't know. Foreign Minister Zarif always tells us that Syria is not his subject." I said, "Okay, I'll get some points of contact." I did, brought them back. Bottom line, no interest at the top in our government, a fear that such a discussion could distract from the main event, the nuclear agreement. Leave aside the fact that the nuclear agreement is gone now, I still believe that we missed an opportunity. Iranians can walk and chew gum at the same time. I don't see why Americans can't do it. I think there was an opportunity missed. Few brief comments on Salman's presentation. The Idlib situation, of course, everybody is worried about potential deterioration. My sense is that one of the reasons the Russians, so far, have been pretty adept at keeping the lid on this situation is that they fear that if the lid is removed, their client will once again use chemical weaponry, and that the response from the United States will be fairly devastating. I think the administration has been pretty effective in convincing the Russians that there will be a very, very powerful reply if the Assad regime resorts to this kind of weaponry again. I of course would like to see the whole standard for civilian protection expanded beyond chemical weapons, but this is what it is, and the Russians fear.
Fred, Salman, thank you so much.
public that will not see high cost, both in monetary terms, but also, of course, in terms of American troops and presences on the ground. And there, I think the vision has something to it. The aspect of staying in Syria, in northeast Syria, is extremely important. The United States should stay in northeast Syria at this point in time, and it should work with its partners and local communities in devising the kind of northeast Syria, at least, which can serve as an example, but which also should act as an impetus not towards division, but towards a broader dialogue between Syrians. And I know the US is worried about that too. Secondly, is the economic link to that, the economic strangulation of those who continue to reject a political process. I think it was mentioned 65-70% of the resources of Syria are in the northeast, but also the sanctions, the more targeted sanctions towards individuals and entities, the oil sanctions that we've been seeing that have been, these are having an effect. In fact, I've heard, again, quite compelling sort of testimony from Russians and from Syrians in terms of the economic costs that are only now starting to be further ratcheted up. Having said that, let's make sure that these are ones that do not, and Syrians say this to us across the board, make lives of Syrians more miserable than they already are. And that is extremely important in that regard. But then, most important thing that I heard in terms of the vision is tying US interests, whether it's the enduring defeat of Daesh or ISIS, or containing and withdrawing Iran to a political, and all foreign forces to a political process. I haven't heard that before, certainly from this administration. Now the question is, what kind of political process, especially if the current efforts continue to stall? We need more ingenuity. It's not going to come, frankly speaking, from the Europeans, and I'm really sorry to say that. I think President Macron and Angela Merkel and the Germans have been trying. They have been trying to see in their own way where there can be convergence between the Russians and the folks and the Turks and Europe and the small group. But at the end of the day, you need the United States to take a role in that. That's extremely important at this point in time, because up till now, the Astana group has been working in a political vacuum of ideas. And that's why they've been able to go forward, which is why I have stressed and emphasized that some of the Syrian ideas at this point in time should form an important part of it. In terms of, just quickly, in terms of all your divergences, well, I've already talked about on the European-US side, there is a worry I have that some on the European side, including the country where I come from, are now focused more on containment and freeze. You can't freeze the effects of this conflict. You have to work to resolve it. For God's sake, we should have realized that after 7-8 years of what's been going on. And so I hope that, and secondly, the divergence in terms of the European and American position on Iran is also leading to some soul-searching, I would say. Frankly speaking, as one senior European diplomat said to me, we don't want even the work in the Northeast to be a mask for just containing the Iranians. So there's some things to sort out here. But again, we've got important and seasoned diplomats who are working that. On the US-Israeli side, well, look, the Israelis have understood, despite their efforts, and they would say correct, to hit their red lines, to build capabilities, but not be the story when it comes to Syria. Nevertheless, the Iranians have only grown inside Syria. And that, while not having a natural constituency of support inside Syria by the Syrian people. So herein is a problem. I wish, and this is something, again, I was a fairly frequent visitor to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv as well. I wish Prime Minister Netanyahu had put in one talking point one particular talking point in his conversations with both American presidents and latest President Trump and President Putin, which was that we think that a more credible political process leading to a political transition is in all our interests. I don't believe that talking point was delivered. And as a result, Israel is now facing a real problem in vis-a-vis as it sees its own interests vis-a-vis what's going on in Syria and Iran. The disappointment aspect, sure, as I said, yes, there is a crisis of expectations, but how do we harness it? How do we get people not to continue to keep looking over their shoulder when they express even the smallest bit of view? Now, what we have seen is that Syrians are expressing themselves, at least on social media, even from within government-held areas. There have been some noticeable points of dissent to certain laws or decrees which have come out more recently. But again, and for sure, I think the government of Syria is going to face its biggest problems in peacetime, not just in war. And we're entering into at least a more de-escalating situation, unless it chooses to ratchet it up and we can't stop him. But the challenge is how do we harness that? How do we harness the people with real capabilities, technocrats, former government officials, or even government officials who have a contribution to make? How do we? Thank you. How do we get a fledgling civil society, which is even in loyalist areas, trying to do something? I think we're under attack.
We're in the Middle East Institute. It's okay.
And that is why I think, again, going back to my main point, we need some more ingenuity when it comes to the process itself.
Thank you so much, Salman. Fred?
I agree entirely with Salman that the development of a U.S. vision is a good development. I mean, this administration with Jim Jeffrey, I think, in the lead on this particular thing, is making a genuine effort to define objectives, create a strategy, and identify the resources needed to implement the strategy. Under President Obama, Syria was a subset, an often annoying subset of the president's top priority, which was to get that Iran nuclear agreement. I think, obviously, if American forces east of the Euphrates begin to take casualties, there will be pressure for the United States to liquidate its commitment there. I think that President Trump can make a very reasonable case to the American people about why American persistence in all of this is needed. My fear is that the case he will make will be rejected by many people who, under different circumstances with a different president, would regard that case as quite cogent. The thing that I think is missing from the American vision is a broader commitment to protecting civilians in Syria. There's never been a problem in protecting civilians from ISIS depredations. There has always been a problem. And my fear is that in limiting the assurance of an armed response to the use of chemical weapons, we inadvertently give Assad a green light to using absolutely everything else at his disposal. And as I think we all know, over the course of this 7.5, nearly 8 years, fewer than 1% of those slaughtered in this conflict have been killed with chemical weapons. The disagreements between Europeans and Americans over Reconstruction, I think it really does boil down literally to a dollar and cents proposition. Who is going to pay? All right. I have no doubt that there are European companies that would love to dive into the middle of reconstruction in Syria. You've got people salivating over a potential price tag of upwards, I've seen upwards of $400 billion, maybe more than that. But is a Siemens, for example, going to insert itself into Syria without somebody writing checks? And whose taxpayers exactly are going to take that on, knowing full well that anything inserted into Syria through the Assad family and entourage is not at the end of the day going to be doing much good in terms of objective reconstruction deliverables. U.S.-Israeli divergences, look, from the beginning, there has been a strong school of thought within Israel that Assad is the devil we know. We've been dealing with this family since 1970, even before. Let's stick with that. What Israelis have to consider is the amount of Assad indebtedness to the Iranians, Assad's total dependence on Iranian-commanded ground forces to keep him in power. And Israel obviously has a problem with an Iranian-commanded armed presence. Assad, in essence, in many respects, is subordinate to demand. Crisis of expectations in Syria, yes, it's real. The difficulty is, as it has been from the beginning, within the Assad entourage, Bashar is seen as the personification of whatever legitimacy exists for this regime. Remove him, and it's off to the races. Nobody knows where it will land. So the regime, I think, even though it is not performing well, has a certain survivability right now, because the security instruments have no particular reason right now to move against it. And finally, my closest Syrian friends, people I have known, God help me, for over a half century, remain supportive of the Assad regime. My closest friends. Why is that? They have no illusions about the corruption, the incompetence, and the brutality of this crew. No illusions at all. But they ask themselves, what's the alternative? And they've been asking themselves this question for nearly 8 years now. All right, which is why I focus personally on the possibilities offered by what is done in terms of stabilization, reconstruction, helping to bring about an alternative governance model in Syria, east of the Euphrates River, and perhaps Syria ultimately in the north toward Idlib. As long as there is no perceived alternative, the default position of people who have no particular appreciation for the family or the entourage, the default position is going to be to support it anyway.
Just a very quick word
Just
from Salman.
very quick, just to respond. I'm sorry to. We should hear actually more from the audience, but just quickly to say on the alternative. One of the things I've heard actually from a regime figure, let's say, is the worry that if there is progress elsewhere in Syria, this will further undermine them. So what you're saying in terms of, that is a real worry that they have. But let me just say, I should have said it, in terms of US policy when it comes to the Northeast, there is one very skilled ambassador with a very small group of diplomats with him. That needs to be increased.
Totally.
They're now starting to meet with Syrians who no longer are just being directed by the Syrian Democratic Council or the PYD. They're meeting them independently and they're listening to them, but it's not enough. Secondly, the US needs to continue its coordination role. Yes, it needs to put money in, but even more importantly, because the money will come, it's coming from Saudi Arabia, it's coming from the UAE, it's coming from Germany now, it will come from other European countries. The coordination role that the US must play through its START programs and others is absolutely essential if we're not to have regional rivalries and other layers of complexities on top of
This
other
is
issues.
actually much more important than whatever contribution the U.S. taxpayer makes to this. To me, the monetary contribution from the United States is the least important of all this. It's the manpower, the skill, resources we're willing to put into what is going to be an incredibly heavy diplomatic lift over years.
And we have an example of that because in 2012, the U.S. stepped back when it came to the support for the armed groups on the ground. And frankly, we had a series of factionalized football teams supported by different external actors. The third most important is for it to push the Syrian Democratic Council or any other authority that is going to be much more inclusive to open up the civil space for Syrians and Syrian communities to take part. We don't want a rerun of Ba'athist or other kind of authoritarian ways in this particular area. And finally, the PYD or any other Syrian party in the SDF have to cut their ties to the PKK. It was careless to lose Turkey, in my view, whether it's to do with the broader picture to the Astana group as such, or whether it's to do with this particular situation. You will only achieve it, though, through dialogue. And that's why you need an Arab-Kurdish dialogue to take place, which will inform those kind of policy prescriptions.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's open up. I'll take 3 questions first. If I can ask you to introduce yourselves and try and make it brief, because we might be able to have another round of 3 afterwards. So we'll start with Dan at the front. We have a microphone coming to you.
Daniel Sirwood, Johns Hopkins SAIS. I was very glad to hear Charles's remark about the conditions in regime-controlled areas, because as dramatically important as the Northeast is, 6 goals is about 5 too many for the United States. And really, our willingness to do governance is doubtful. The President of the United States is against it. Now, he's undisciplined, therefore hasn't prohibited it, but I really do doubt our capabilities. The question is, Salman, I think the question is not how we can harness what's going on in the regime-controlled areas, but how we can enable people in regime-controlled areas to begin to have some freedom of expression. And I think that requires much more focus than Washington has been given. Sorry, that was a comment, not a question.
And then you say, what do you think? And then it's a question. The woman at the back.
Hey, I'm Asil. I'm from Human Rights First and from Syracuse University. So my question, we talk about like dialogue, we talk about like no regime change clearly, and then no alternative for the Assad. And we talk about the diplomatic process during this period, which will take really long time. Are we going to see US and the West doing more traditional diplomatic tools like opening the embassies, sitting like in the table with the Assad, regardless to all his crimes and his human rights violation? Thank you.
And gentleman at the front.
Hi, David Thompson, United Nations Refugee Agency. For Mr. Shaikh, in including refugees in this discussion, can you address that, sir?
Okay. Salman, Fred?
Do you want to start first?
Sure.
For a change.
After you.
You know, Daniel, the willingness of the United States to do governance being doubtful, I can't disagree with that. My sense is that the president himself has backed away from his earlier position that we should basically finish off ISIS militarily and get out. How solid that revised position is, I have no way of knowing. I'll leave to Salman the part of your question about enabling people in the regime areas to have freedom of expression. My sense, the answer to the question back here is that the United States, I don't believe, has any plans to reopen Embassy Damascus, and has no plans to deal with the Assad regime. That's just my strong sense.
Salman?
I would say that the original sin when it came to Syria was the inability of all of us to ensure the protection of civilians and to ensure the international law. It shouldn't have been just couched in terms of regime change and things like that. It was about making sure that people had their rights. And that goes down to the question that you've even talked about right now in terms of enabling freedom of expression. Of course, but what we notice in our dialogues is that there are times when there is more space for people to come out, let's meet in Beirut or elsewhere, and to engage in discussions, and there are other times when it's closed down. Inside the country, it's even more difficult. I totally agree with you, and that's why social media, people posting anonymously or whatever, has been perhaps the best way for people still to express themselves. But let's not be under any illusions. At this point in time, I think there is a pervasive sense of intimidation and fear. And that's why I go back to the point that you have to have some form of an internationally backed and guaranteed dialogue process which will enable, or give these people the legitimate protected space in which to really be able to express themselves. But it of course needs to be done at all societal levels. So one hopes that that broader process would enable that kind of expression to be heard much more within communities and much more at the local level. But 8 years on, we're still finding that a huge challenge. In terms of US governance, I don't think anyone is advocating that the US start to play a role in governance itself. In the Northeast, you have these local councils as such, and you have them in the Northwest as well. But no one has yet come across a model which is working in the Northeast. The US has, I think, a particular leverage, particular point of pressure which it should apply. I'll give you an example. Raqqa Council today, inside the city, is not representative of its Arab citizens. It does have Arabs on the council, but they are incompetent on top of not being representative. They don't even have the minimum skills for the areas that they're supposed to be looking after. And of course, if they were, they wouldn't have the decision-making authority that they need to have in order to move things forward. Finally, when it comes to service delivery, there are the resources in any case. When resources are brought in, those are siphoned off to Kurdish areas. So these are the kinds of things which the United States can't do by itself, but where local people, very capable people, can play a much greater role. And that is what they are telling us, and that's what they are in discussion with their Syrian Kurdish cousins as well, and Syrian Arab cousins. Refugees, absolutely. I mean, this is an area where I think we're all failing, and certainly we have been thinking about it. I think our main engagement in trying to bring Syrian refugees into it is through particular civil society groups and others who are operating, particularly in Turkey and Lebanon.
Thank you. I'm probably going to be told off for this because we're almost out of time, but I'm going to extend for a few more questions. So the lady at the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Karen Volker with Cure Violence. I want to pick up on something that Salman and Fred both alluded to, which is our collective failure with respect to the protection of civilians in Syria. And I'm wondering, what more can we do? What more should we be doing as an international community as we enter into this period and trying to push for a political solution? In the meanwhile, to see if we can really actually raise the volume of people who are calling for civilians to stop being slaughtered and basically change the norms. As an international community, we set the norms on what we accept and what we don't accept. And right now, we're accepting people being killed every day in Syria. I think that we need to raise the volume, and how can we get all of the parties to be more focused on that, even while we're trying to find a political solution.
Thank you. Any other questions? The two people in the middle will go one after the other, and then we'll close up.
Hi, Ellen Bevier with the Syrian American Medical Society. I think we've noticed a trend of persecution and criminalization of humanitarian workers throughout the conflict. I want to know how we can include their protection in the peace process.
Thanks. I'll just sit, if it's okay. Alan Makovsky with the Center for American Progress. Thanks. Good to hear fascinating presentations by two old friends. Salman, you said that part of the solution in the Northeast has to be the PYD cutting ties with the PKK. I think I heard that's what you said at the end. That's not easy, as you know. And I'm just wondering, is that really more likely than, let's say, some sort of, through U.S. influence, some sort of broadening of the governance base, that a more inclusive governance that dilutes the power of the PYD, or your assumption is the PYD is going to be the dominant power?
It's absolutely required, but it's not enough. You see, because the decision-making, it's not a perception, it's real. Decision-making is not done just solely even by the co-presidents of the Syrian Democratic Council, let alone at the local level. It's connected to a few individuals who are outside the country. So, and you see, the greater worry I have is that Turkey is going to take matters into its own hand, and that's going to come sooner rather than later, and that's going to create an unholy mess for everyone to deal with. So that is why, I put that there, because at the end of the day, it's Syrians who should be determining their own future in any case. Now, it's all linked also with the security situation and how far does the US go in pushing those kinds of ideas when you are relying predominantly on a PYD-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces in your fight against Daesh. But my own feeling, and of course I would say this because I'm part of it, my own feeling is that through dialogue, one can make progress. It won't be instant, but it needs to be results-orientated. And from what we've heard, and I can't say everything, to be honest with you, we think there are possibilities where people, and serious people, can enter into dialogue with each other, with, I hope, American and Turkish support. And so let us continue to test that. Let us continue to see how we can move it. But not starting and not working on the concrete elements, I said at the same time, when it comes to governance structures and the civil space and things like that, means that we're not going to be anywhere, and we should be somewhere within a 6 to 12 month period.
Fred?
On civilian protection, I mean, clearly, the Trump administration has gotten the idea across to the Russians that if your client employs chemicals, there will be a military response from the United States, and this administration has demonstrated twice. I mean, you can argue about the efficacy of each one of the operations, but twice the administration has responded. I'd like to see what I've recommended, consistently over the years is tell the Russians it's not just chemicals. It's not just chemicals. Mass slaughter will bring about the possibility, if not the certainty, of American military retaliation. And what's required there, obviously, is that this must not be a bluff, Okay. One issue we've not mentioned today, but I think is perhaps the key to determining whether there will ever be an Assad regime change of heart in terms of engaging seriously in some kind of a political process. This is the issue of detainees. God knows, God alone knows, well, maybe the regime knows, how many tens of thousands of people are still being illegally detained by the regime, suffering, starvation, lack of medical attention, torture, rape, you name it. I think this is an important issue to pursue. Protection of humanitarian workers obviously is tremendously important. When we do not respond to incidents of mass slaughter solely on the grounds that chemicals were not employed, then we see white helmets and others being killed and detained. And although he wasn't a humanitarian worker per se, I guess my last words today is that I will regret for the rest of my life the loss of Raad Faris.
Indeed. Yes. And Salman.
Just to say, I'm sorry, I didn't answer on this. The only addition I can say is regarding accountability. I'm glad the United States is continuing to fund and support the IIIM mechanism within the UN General Assembly. I think, as difficult as it is, accountability has to still be part of this for everyone who's been involved in committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and egregious violations of international humanitarian law in Syria. As difficult as that is, as we've seen in other situations, and we're seeing with Yemen now, there has to be a moral consensus still in amongst all of this, which says these kinds of things are unacceptable, and that if they happen, you will be held accountable. So in that respect, I hope that the US will continue to support mechanisms such as the IIIM.
I completely agree. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, as I said earlier. Salman, Fred, Hadi, thank you for your excellent remarks and comments. I think it's been an extremely rich discussion. I think we could probably go on for another hour. I certainly could. But I think in the interest of time, we should end here.
I think we could too, and hopefully we'll do it with a woman next time as well.
Yes, exactly. But if you do have any other questions for any of the panelists, I'm sure they'll be hanging around for the next few minutes. So thank you again very much. Please come back to the Middle East Institute for any of our future events. Thank you.